On this episode of Doin the Most, we're going to make sourdough sandwich bread. Now I'll have you note that this isn't your typical rustic looking sourdough loaf. This recipe was formulated for sandwich bread. So you'll get a lot of those wonderful sourdough notes, but in a loaf that's good for cutting sandwich bread slices. So let's jump into the ingredients. 4 1/4 cups of bread flour, 2 cups of water, 2/3 cup sourdough starter, 2 teaspoons of yeast, and 1.5 teaspoons of salt. Some of you at home may be saying, but I don't have a sourdough starter. I'm going to teach you how I make mine. Making one is pretty simple. You're going to need a mason jar. In that mason jar, you're going to add equal parts flour and water, and then add a very little bit of yeast and a very little bit of sugar, and then let that ferment for a couple of days. After a few days, you'll have a nice layer of hooch developed on the top of it. You'll want to pour that and a little bit of the starter off, and then just replace what's missing with a little bit more water and flour. Over time, the yeast in your starter will convert the sugars into alcohols. That, combined with the lactic acid created by naturally occurring lactobacilli, will create the sour flavor in your sourdough starter. I want to make a point here that some folks will not actually add yeast to the starter. They will rely on the natural yeasts that are in the flour. But I like to add a little bit of yeast whenever I'm making a starter to help move it along. Those yeasts are going to mutate so much by the time you make your bread. In a lot of recipes, you're going to be adding baker's yeast for leavening anyhow. This recipe is one such recipe. Now, my sourdough starter has been going for several months now, and you want yours to go for at least a couple of weeks before you use it. So you're going to start with your flour. I've experimented in this loaf with using whole wheat flour or mixtures of bread flour and whole wheat flour. I've even used white flour, all-purpose flour. I find, though, that bread flour seems to work the best for the most consistent results in this recipe. Then we're going to be adding our sourdough starter. Your starter should be kind of thick and syrupy for this. You don't want it to be too wet, you don't want it to be too clumpy. A nice kind of pancake batter consistency is what you're going for. Then you can use your water to clean out your measuring cup and add your water. I keep bread yeast in bulk, so I'm going to measure out my bread yeast for this here from a mason jar I keep in my cabinet. And we want to make sure that's spread around so it's nice and consistent throughout the entire loaf. And then a little bit of salt. I use sea salt almost always in my kitchen. I prefer non-iodized salt because that iodine flavor is kind of offensive to me, and so I just avoid it. Now casually, we're going to mix that around until the entire mixture is homogeneous. And you'll see here that it's kind of stretchy, like pizza dough. That's the texture that we're going for, and we just want this to come up and combine. I cover mine with a damp paper towel, and then that is going to sit and proof overnight. That will allow all the yeasts from the sourdough starter and from the bread yeast to do their thing and create CO2 and flavor. The next morning, we will uncover our bread dough, take a little bit of a pat of butter, and put that in our 4x9 loaf pan. I understand some folks will use fats with a higher smoke point like ghee, but I find that butter works just fine. You want to make sure you cover every square inch of that pan, and then you can use a little bit of that butter to lubricate your spatula and release your loaf from the bowl. You're trying to crush this as much as you can, deflate all those bubbles, and then pour it evenly into your loaf pan and spread it around. So that way you have a very consistent, or as consistent as possible, loaf. Those crushed bubbles will end up opening back up some, as well as new bubbles forming, and that's what gives you the consistent crumb texture throughout the loaf, which is what we identify, at least here in America, with sandwich bread. So we're taking our oven up to 350 degrees. Once that loaf has risen nice and high outside the pan, that will go in for 45 minutes. If your oven's like mine, you may need to rotate it throughout baking to make sure it bakes consistently. After 45 minutes, you will bring that over and release it from the pan, and it is going to cool on a cooling rack so that way you get nice airflow all the way around your loaf. And we are going to let that cool completely before we cut into it. Hours later, our loaf is room temperature, and we are going to slice this into sandwich slices. I will be the first to admit that I am not very good at slicing bread, but I do my best and use the longest, most deeply serrated knife I have, and it usually makes quick work of it. Now this bread disappears really fast around my house, so I'm not always super concerned with how beautiful it is. It may not be the prettiest loaf of bread, but it will be delicious, and it will make great sandwiches. We'll have a video coming out soon of a walnut butter that you can use to make sandwiches with this loaf, so stay tuned for that. It's Anna's own recipe for walnut butter. And look at that crumb. Beautiful sandwich bread. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you liked the bread. Of course, you know you can follow us on Instagram and Pinterest at Doin the Most OK, or visit our website at dointhemost.org. Thanks for watching.